They had overcome the invisible barriers that had separated them, and now, with Charlie by his side, Lucas knew that the future would be full of new possibilities. Lucas left a drawing and a chocolate bar on a park bench every day for Harold, a homeless man. But one day, when he got to the park, Lucas saw a man with bodyguards sitting on the bench. The soft rustling of leaves and the chirping of birds were the soundtrack of the park. For 8-year-old Lucas, every day started the same, but the world he saw was more colorful than most people's. Lucas was different from his classmates. With his shy posture, skinny frame, and big brown eyes, he always walked with his gaze fixed on the ground and his glasses sliding down his nose. Lucas spent most of his time alone, drawing. His drawings were a way to escape a world where he felt invisible. At school, his classmates ran, laughed, and played ball, but he preferred the quiet and peace of the park. There, he could lose himself in his sketches, creating imaginary worlds, bringing to life characters and settings that filled the emptiness inside him. Every day, after school, he walked to the park, past the old oak tree, and headed toward the bench where Harold and his loyal dog, Rusty, always sat. Harold never asked anyone for anything, and his quiet presence contrasted with the clear affection he showed Rusty. Lucas watched them from a distance and felt a silent connection with the man who, like him, seemed invisible to the rest of the world. One morning, Lucas decided to leave something for Harold, a small gesture of kindness. He drew a picture of Harold and Rusty, capturing how the man and the dog seemed to be extensions of one another. He also decided to leave a chocolate bar, one of his favorites, as a simple offering. The next day, Lucas repeated the gesture, eagerly hoping Harold would find the drawing and the chocolate. But that day, when he arrived at the park, the scene at the bench was completely different. Instead of Harold and Rusty, there was a man in a fancy suit sitting there, surrounded by bodyguards. Lucas hid behind a tree, watching, confused about what was happening. The man seemed anxious, checking his watch repeatedly, and the presence of the bodyguards made everything even more tense. Lucas didn't know who that man was or what he wanted, but he knew Harold wasn't there, and that made him uneasy. Where was Harold? Why was that stranger sitting in his spot? Lucas watched the man on the bench, his heart racing. That place belonged to no one else but Harold and Rusty, and their absence troubled him. He wondered if the man in the suit and his bodyguards had something to do with it. Something inside him told him it wasn't a coincidence. The man in the suit looked more and more impatient. He stood up, paced in circles, mumbled something to the bodyguard beside him, then sat back down. With every nervous move, Lucas shrank further behind the tree. He wanted to approach, to ask what was going on, but the fear of being scolded kept him in place. Did Harold leave? Lucas thought, clutching the chocolate he had brought that day. He didn't know much about Harold, only what he saw from afar. A quiet man, always with his dog, someone who seemed at peace with the silence. But now, the silence in the park felt different. There was a tension in the air. Something was out of place. Lucas kept watching until, finally, the man on the bench stood up and began walking toward the park's exit. The bodyguard followed closely behind. The boy let out a sigh of relief when he realized they were leaving. As soon as the strangers disappeared around the bend, Lucas ran over to the bench. He looked around, as if searching for a sign of Harold. But the park was empty, except for the birds and the wind making the leaves fall from the trees. Lucas sat on the bench where Harold used to sit and placed the chocolate beside him, just like always. However, the absence of Harold and Rusty made the moment sadder than he had expected. Will he come back? Lucas wondered quietly. Days passed slowly. Every morning, Lucas returned to the park, repeating his gesture of leaving a drawing and a chocolate on the bench. But the spot remained empty. Harold and Rusty never appeared. And every day, the man in the suit and his bodyguards returned, sat on the bench for a while, and left with the same frustrated expression. Lucas's mind began to make up stories. Maybe Harold had left because of that man. Or worse, something could have happened to him and Rusty. Harold's absence started to weigh on Lucas's heart, and the park, which had once been his refuge, now seemed empty and lifeless without the man and his dog. Finally, on one of the days, the man in the suit noticed Lucas. The boy was farther from the bench, leaning against a tree, holding his sketchbook and watching from a distance, just like he did every day. The man, with a curious look, walked toward him. Lucas froze, his stomach tightening. "Hey, kid," said the man, surprisingly calm. "You come here a lot, don't you?" Lucas just nodded, not knowing what to say. The man looked at him for a moment, as if trying to decide whether he could trust him. Then, he continued, "You ever see an older man with a black dog around here?" Lucas felt a lump in his throat. Yeah, he replied, his voice almost breaking. I saw him every day, but now he's gone. The man sighed, running a hand through his hair. He looked exhausted. That man is my father, he revealed, his face showing a mix of sadness and regret. We lost contact years ago. I've been looking for him. Do you know what happened? Lucas was surprised by the confession, but something inside him felt sorry for the man. He seemed lost, and suddenly his presence in the park made sense. The tension Lucas had felt before now seemed more like a desperate search. He looked at the man, who seemed to be waiting for an answer. This man in his expensive suit, who had everything, was searching for something that money couldn't buy. He used to sit here every day with his dog. I left drawings and chocolates for them, Lucas said, almost like a confession, but he hasn't shown up for days. The man gave a faint smile, surprised. You cared about him? Lucas nodded. The man looked around, taking a deep breath before turning back to Lucas. If you see him again, could you tell him that his son wants to meet him? I just want to say I'm sorry. Lucas nodded, feeling the seriousness of the situation weighing on him. He didn't know when he would see Harold again, but somehow, he felt like he needed to help. Days dragged on slowly, and Lucas kept going back to the park, hoping to see Harold and Rusty again. But with each visit, all he saw was the empty bench, and the man in the suit kept showing up with the same tense and frustrated expression. Even though he didn't say anything, Lucas could tell the man was losing hope. Maybe he's never coming back, Lucas thought sometimes, even though he refused to believe it. Something inside him made him keep going, like a part of him knew Harold was still out there somewhere. Then, on a cold morning, everything changed. Lucas arrived at the park earlier than usual. The wind was blowing hard, and the dry leaves swirled across the ground, forming colorful whirlwinds. As he approached the bench, his heart began to race. There they were, Harold and Rusty. The image was exactly as Lucas remembered. Harold sitting calmly, with Rusty lying at his feet, both of them seemingly unaware of the world around them. Lucas stood still for a few seconds, unable to believe he had finally found them again. It was like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders, and he couldn't help but smile with relief. But then, anxiety crept in. He remembered the request from the man in the suit, Harold's son, who had been waiting for days to reconcile with his father. Lucas knew he needed to tell Harold, but at the same time, he didn't want to scare him or be intrusive. With his heart pounding, he approached slowly. Rusty was the first to notice him, raising his head and lazily wagging his tail. Harold looked at the dog, then at Lucas, and a soft look of surprise crossed his face. You again, huh? Harold said in a raspy voice, but not in an unfriendly way. He gave a small smile, and Lucas immediately felt more at ease. Lucas hesitated for a second, then pulled the chocolate bar out of his pocket and handed it to Harold. I used to leave this here for you, he explained with a shy smile. And also, I left some drawings. Harold chuckled softly, taking the chocolate. So it was you, kid? Well, thanks. I always wondered where those things were coming from. Lucas sat down next to Harold, feeling like this conversation was the start of something deeper. The two of them sat in silence for a moment, while Harold unwrapped the chocolate and offered some to Rusty, who wagged his tail happily. You've been gone, Lucas finally said, his voice calm but full of curiosity. Harold sighed. Yeah, I had to stay away for a while. There was someone I was trying to avoid. Lucas knew exactly who Harold was talking about, and it made his stomach churn. He looked at the man beside him and with a quiet voice said, Your son has been coming here. He wants to talk to you. Harold's reaction was immediate. The smile vanished from his face, and his expression hardened. He looked away, shaking his head slowly, as if Lucas's words had brought back an old wound. He told me he's sorry, Lucas continued, despite the growing fear inside him. He said he wants to apologize. Harold stayed silent, his eyes fixed on Rusty, who was still chewing on the chocolate. The silence between them felt like it lasted forever, until finally, Harold let out a deep sigh, his voice tired and full of pain. It's easy to say sorry after all this time, Harold said bitterly. It's easy to ask for forgiveness when you're far away from the damage you caused. Lucas bit his lip, not knowing how to respond. He didn't know the whole story, but he could feel the weight of the emotions Harold was carrying. The distance between father and son wasn't just physical. It was a barrier built over years of unspoken words and unresolved hurt. Harold looked at Lucas, his eyes tired but sincere. You're too young to understand, kid. Sometimes, things are too complicated to be fixed. I know, Lucas responded, his voice steadier than he expected. But I saw how he talked about you. He really regrets it. And I think he just wants a chance to say he's sorry. How would you feel if you didn't give him that chance? Harold didn't respond right away. He kept looking at Lucas, thinking over his words with an unreadable expression. Finally, he let out a long sigh. Maybe you're right, he said quietly, his voice hesitant. Maybe it's time to face what happened, but that doesn't mean it'll be easy. Lucas nodded, feeling a wave of relief. I can talk to him for you, if you want. Harold hesitated again, but this time, there was less resistance in his expression. He looked down at Rusty, who was now lying beside him with his eyes half closed. All right, Harold finally said. Tell him I'll be here tomorrow. Same time. If he really wants to talk to me, he can come. Lucas smiled, feeling like something was finally changing. He had done his part, and now the rest was up to Harold and his son. As Lucas got up to leave, Harold called out to him one more time. Thanks, kid, he said with a sincere smile. Sometimes, small gestures can make a bigger difference than we realize. Lucas smiled back. I think that's true. The next day, Lucas arrived at the park earlier than usual. The thought that today would be an important day had kept him restless all night. He knew Harold had agreed to meet his son, but something in his eyes the day before suggested this would be harder than he was willing to admit. Lucas just hoped that when the meeting happened, things wouldn't fall apart. When Harold and Rusty appeared, Lucas was already waiting for them on the bench. The man greeted him with a nod and a weak smile, but it was clear he was nervous. He sat down next to Lucas and let out a heavy sigh, petting Rusty, who was calmly resting at his feet. Is he coming? Harold asked, without looking directly at Lucas, as if he feared hearing the answer. Lucas nodded. Yeah, he said he'll be here today, same time. Harold kept petting Rusty in silence, but Lucas could see that he was fighting an internal battle. It was as if years of hurt and regret were all weighing on his shoulders at once. It's funny, you know, Harold began to speak after a few minutes. You go through your whole life trying to do what you think is right. You believe you're making the right choices, even when others tell you you're wrong. And in the end, it's only after you've lost everything that you realize maybe you did it all wrong. Lucas didn't know what to say. He felt that this was an important moment, but he also knew that any words he said might interfere too much. So, he stayed quiet, listening. My son Nathan, Harold continued, still not taking his eyes off Rusty, was stubborn, just like me. He always thought he knew everything. When he started making money, he thought he didn't need me anymore. And I let him go. I was hurt, angry, and I didn't do anything to stop him from drifting away. Because deep down, I was too proud. And when pride takes over, kid, you lose the most important thing. Lucas listened carefully, feeling the pain in Harold's words. Over the years, Harold said, his voice now lower, almost a whisper, I watched his life from a distance. I knew he was doing well, knew he was successful, but I never had the courage to get close again. It was easier to stay here, quiet, with Rusty, away from it all. He paused and finally looked at Lucas for the first time since he began speaking. Until he disappeared from my life completely, Lucas felt a tightness in his chest. He could see the regret in Harold's eyes, a pain that seemed to have built up over the years. The hardest part of all, kid, Harold continued, is that deep down, I knew he just needed me to say I was there for him, that it was okay to make mistakes, that it was okay to fail. But I never said that. He chuckled, without humor. And now, here I am, a homeless old man, with my dog. And he's successful. And he wants to say he's sorry. Lucas finally found the words, his voice soft and hesitant. Maybe he's waiting for you to forgive him, just like you're waiting for him to do the same. Harold shook his head, still skeptical. Forgiveness is complicated, kid. It's not something you give or get easily. And sometimes, the hurt is so deep that it feels like it'll never go away. But before Lucas could respond, he heard footsteps approaching. He looked up the path, and there was Nathan, Harold's son. He was walking slowly, his hands in his pockets, his expression tense but determined. The moment that both father and son had been waiting for was about to happen. Nathan stopped a few feet away, watching his father for a moment before speaking. Hey, Dad, he said, his voice cautious, almost as if he were afraid of how Harold would respond. Harold stayed silent for a second that seemed to last an eternity, but then he sighed, looking at Nathan with eyes full of conflicting emotions. Hey, son, Harold finally said. His voice choked up. Nathan slowly approached and sat next to his father, keeping a respectful distance. For a long time, neither of them said anything. They just sat there, side by side, unsure of how to start talking about the chasm that had formed between them over the years. Lucas, sitting on the other side of Harold, felt that this moment wasn't for him. So, silently, he stood up and walked a little farther away, giving father and son the space they needed. The distance Lucas kept allowed him to observe from afar, without interfering. He saw Nathan struggling to find the right words and Harold fighting to keep his composure. Rusty, sensing the tension, rested his head on Harold's lap, as if he knew his owner needed comfort. "I messed up, Dad," Nathan finally began, his voice filled with emotion. "I was selfish, and I left you behind. I thought I knew everything, thought I didn't need you, but I was wrong. I'm sorry, truly." Harold listened, but didn't respond immediately. His eyes were fixed on the ground, but Lucas could see he was absorbing every word, feeling the weight of years of separation and regret. Nathan, for his part, seemed anxious for a response, any sign that his father would forgive him. Finally, Harold took a deep breath. "It's not easy to forget what happened, Nathan," he said, his voice still hoarse. "But I messed up too. I should have been there for you. I should have told you that you could always count on me, even when things went wrong. And I didn't." Nathan nodded, his eyes brimming with tears. "Can we try again? Start over?" Harold looked at his son, and in that moment, something seemed to break inside him. The tired and bitter man finally gave in, letting the barriers that had kept him from his son fall away. He gave a small smile, a smile full of both pain and relief at the same time. "Yes, son," he said softly. "Let's try again." When Lucas saw Harold and Nathan sitting together on the park bench, a sense of relief and curiosity grew in his chest. He knew that the conversation wouldn't be easy for either of them, but he also knew that the most important thing had already happened. They were both there, ready to talk. Lucas kept watching from a distance, wanting to give them the space they needed to work through their pain. Harold and Nathan remained silent for a few more minutes. Rusty's presence beside Harold seemed to bring some comfort to the old man, who absent-mindedly petted the dog's head, as if it helped him gather his thoughts. Nathan, on the other hand, looked down at his hands, nervously intertwining his fingers, trying to find the right words. I'm sorry," Nathan finally said, his voice cracking under the weight of years of silence. "I know I messed up. I was arrogant. I thought I knew everything, and I left you behind. I can't change the past, but I wanna fix this." Harold sighed deeply, as if he were carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. His eyes were tired, full of hurt and regret, but also with a softness that Lucas had never seen before. It was as if the old man was finally ready to face what he had been avoiding for so long. "Nathan," Harold began, his voice hoarse and full of emotion, "I made mistakes too. I let my pride get in the way. When you left, I should have gone after you. But I didn't. I couldn't." Nathan shook his head, feeling the pain in his father's words. "I didn't want things to get to this point, Dad. I was young. I thought I knew everything, thought I didn't need anyone. But after you were gone, I realized I never stopped needing you. I just didn't know how to come back." Harold took a deep breath, looking at his son with teary eyes. "All these years, I kept wondering how you were doing. I knew you were doing well, but the distance between us just kept growing, and I let that happen." Nathan looked at his father, a single tear sliding down his face. "That was the worst decision of my life, Dad. I thought money and success were everything, but the truth is, none of it ever filled the emptiness. There was always something missing. It was always you." Rusty, sensing the emotion in the air, laid his head on Harold's lap as if he knew that this was a moment of vulnerability. Harold looked at the dog, gently stroking his head, almost automatically. Lucas watched the scene from a distance, feeling the impact of the reunion in his own heart. So much unspoken pain, so many buried hurts. "You know," Harold began again, his voice softer now, "living on the streets, it teaches you a lot about what really matters. And you know what I learned, Nathan? That all this time, there was only one thing I wanted. I just wanted the chance to tell you that I care. I've always cared." Nathan quickly wiped away his tears, but he couldn't hide how much those words meant to him. The silence between them was filled with emotion, but this time, it wasn't the kind of silence that carried the weight of the past. It was a silence that held the promise of a better future. "Can we try again, Dad?" Nathan asked, almost pleading. "I want to get it right this time." Harold looked at his son and smiled faintly, a sad but sincere smile. "Yeah, Nathan, we can try again." The atmosphere around them seemed to change. The wind that blew through the trees was gentler now, and the park, which had once felt filled with unspoken tensions, now felt like a place where new hopes could grow. Lucas, still watching from a distance, felt a mix of joy and relief. He knew that his small act of kindness had been part of that reunion, and it filled him with a sense of purpose. Harold then turned to Lucas, gesturing for him to come closer. The boy slowly approached, still feeling a bit hesitant. When he reached the bench, Harold smiled at him. "Kid, you've done way more than you realize," Harold said, his voice full of gratitude. "If it weren't for you, I don't know if I'd be sitting here right now." Nathan looked at Lucas, surprised. "It was you who helped my dad all this time?" he asked, a mix of admiration and curiosity in his voice. Lucas just nodded, feeling a little shy. "I just left some drawings and chocolate. I didn't want him to feel so alone." Nathan smiled, touched. "You did more than that. You did something I didn't have the courage to do for a long time." Harold sighed again, but this time the tiredness seemed lighter. "The truth, kid, is that small gestures can mean the world to someone. What you did gave me something to look forward to every day, and that's something you should never underestimate." Lucas smiled, feeling the weight of the moment. He didn't know what to say, but Harold's words echoed deep inside him. Somehow, he had helped restore a connection that had seemed lost forever, and that filled him with a quiet sense of fulfillment. Rusty, who had been lying peacefully until then, stood up and walked over to Lucas, wagging his tail as if to thank him too. The boy crouched down to pet the dog, and for a moment, he felt like part of that little family that had been restored. "You'll always be welcome here, Lucas," Harold said, looking warmly at the boy. "Always." The sun began to set on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Lucas said goodbye to Harold and Nathan, promising to come back the next day. As he walked home, he felt like something inside him had changed. What had started as a simple act of kindness had turned into something much bigger. He didn't know what the future held for Harold and Nathan, but he was sure that, somehow, they would find a way to reconnect and move forward. The next day dawned with a soft glow. The sun slowly rose, and the autumn breeze, carrying the scent of dry leaves, brought with it a feeling of renewal. Lucas, as always, arrived at the park early, but this time, there was a lightness to his steps. He knew that something important was happening, not only in Harold and Nathan's lives, but also within himself. When he approached the bench, he saw Harold and Nathan sitting together again, talking calmly. Rusty lay at Harold's feet, looking more relaxed than Lucas had ever seen him. It was as if the weight both men had been carrying was finally starting to lift. Their reconciliation, though still fragile, was beginning to blossom. Harold looked at Lucas as soon as the boy approached. "Hey, kid," he said, with a smile that wasn't just one of gratitude, but also of a certain fatherly affection. "We did what we promised. Nathan and we're starting to understand each other." Nathan looked at Lucas, his eyes showing a glimmer of relief. "My dad told me everything you did for him," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "You have no idea how much that means to me, too." Lucas was silent for a moment, unsure of what to say. He hadn't done any of it expecting thanks or recognition. His gestures had been small, but now, seeing how they'd helped rebuild a broken relationship, he realized that even small acts of kindness could have a massive impact. "I just wanted to help," Lucas finally said, his voice soft. "I didn't know how, but I thought maybe leaving the chocolates and drawings might make a difference." Harold chuckled lightly, but genuinely. "It did, kid. It made all the difference." Their conversation was easy, almost familiar. Nathan shared stories from the time when he and his dad had been close, before pride and mistakes had pulled them apart. Harold listened with a nostalgic smile, as if rediscovering memories he thought had been lost forever. During that time, Lucas felt something shift inside him. Watching the relationship between Harold and Nathan rebuild itself made him reflect on his own life, especially on his relationship with his dad, Michael. The silence between them at home was just as deep as the chasm that had separated Harold and Nathan for years. Lucas wondered if there was a chance to fix things with his dad too. The sun was starting to set when Nathan finally stood up, stretching his legs and preparing to leave. "I've got some things to take care of," he said in a serious tone. "But Dad, I'll be back. I promise. And this time, I won't disappear." Harold nodded, his eyes filled with hope but also caution. "I'll be here," he replied. "I'll be waiting." Nathan turned to Lucas and extended his hand. "Thank you, Lucas," he said, as Lucas shook his hand firmly. "I know you're just a kid, but you did something that many adults can't. You brought two lost people back together." Lucas smiled shyly. "I just did what felt right." Nathan nodded and said goodbye, walking slowly out of the park. Once he disappeared around the curve of the path, Harold looked at Lucas and whispered, "I think my son is finally coming back." Lucas smiled, feeling genuine happiness for the man sitting beside him. He knew that, although the road ahead would be long and full of challenges, Harold and Nathan were on the right path. And, somehow, Lucas had played a part in that. As the evening settled in, Harold and Lucas talked some more. Harold, now much more at peace, began to share pieces of his life with Lucas, things he'd never mentioned before. He talked about the days before he lost everything, about how Nathan's sudden success had built a wall of pride between them. But he also spoke about how, in the past few days, he had learned that it's never too late to try to rebuild what was lost. Lucas listened quietly, absorbing the life lessons Harold was passing on. Even though the old man's story was full of pain and regret, there was now a genuine hope in his words, something Lucas had never seen in him before. Maybe, Lucas thought, people really can change if they're willing to face what they fear most. Before they said their goodbyes, Harold looked at Lucas with a serious but affectionate expression. "Kid," he said, "if there's one thing you can take away from all this, it's that you should never let pride drive away the people you love. Life's too short for that." Lucas nodded, feeling the weight of those words. "I'll remember that." When Harold and Rusty started to leave, Lucas stood and watched as the evening shadows slowly swallowed them up. He knew that it wouldn't be the last time he'd see Harold and Nathan together in the park. Somehow, he was sure that their family was rebuilding itself, brick by brick, and that the hardest part was now behind them. But as Lucas walked home that night, his thoughts turned to his own father. The silence between him and Michael felt heavier than ever. He wondered if there was a way to fix things with his dad too. Maybe, like Harold and Nathan, their problem was also one of pride. A silence that could be broken with the right first step. When he arrived home, everything was the same as always. Quiet, with the distant sound of the TV in the background and the nearly invisible presence of Michael, sitting on the couch, absorbed in his work. Lucas watched his father for a few seconds, feeling the same distance as always, but this time, something inside him pushed him to act. Without thinking too much, Lucas walked over to his dad and sat next to him on the couch. Michael looked at him, surprised, as if he hadn't expected this approach. "Hey, son," he said, a bit awkwardly. "Hey, Dad," Lucas replied, his voice calm but firm. He didn't know exactly what to say or how to start, but he knew this was the first step. "You've been really busy, huh?" Michael looked at him, still confused, but then relaxed a bit. "Yeah, work's been taking up a lot of time," he replied, his voice sounding a little apologetic. Lucas nodded, as if to show he understood. I just want to spend more time with you. I feel like we've been distant." His words came out hesitant, but their impact was immediate. Michael, who always seemed so far away, looked at his son with softer eyes, as if something inside him had shifted too. "I want that too, Lucas," Michael said, his voice full of sincerity. I'm sorry if I've been absent. I don't want it to be like this." Lucas smiled a little, feeling that, even though there was still a lot left unsaid, this was the beginning. Just like Harold and Nathan, he and his dad had a chance to rebuild what seemed lost. It might be a long road, but Lucas was ready to walk it. That night, as he lay in bed, Lucas felt something new inside himself, a hope he didn't know he had. He had seen firsthand how forgiveness and reconciliation could change lives, and now, he was ready to apply it to his own. In the days following Harold and Nathan's reunion, Lucas felt a quiet transformation within himself. The park, which had once been a refuge where he escaped from reality, now seemed like a stage for new understanding. What he had witnessed between Harold and Nathan deeply touched his heart, and it made him think more about his relationship with his own father, Michael. Since that brief conversation with his dad, Lucas had noticed small changes. Michael, though still consumed by work, was now making a visible effort to connect with him. At the end of each day, Lucas noticed that Michael was more present, his eyes no longer wandering away during their conversations, and the silence that had once dominated their home was slowly being replaced by tentative attempts at dialogue. One Saturday morning, Lucas woke up earlier than usual. The morning sun streamed through his bedroom window, casting a soft light on the wooden floor. As he went downstairs, he found Michael in the kitchen, making coffee. The aroma of fresh coffee filled the room, and Michael, noticing his son's presence, smiled softly. "Good morning, son," he said, his voice gentle but still a little hesitant, as if he was getting used to the idea of them being closer. "Good morning, Dad," Lucas replied, feeling warmth in his chest as he realized that, though subtle, Michael's effort was there. He sat down at the table and watched his father place a cup of coffee in front of him. Something simple, but it meant so much more than it seemed. As they drank their coffee in silence, Lucas decided that it was time to try something new. Inspired by what he had seen in the park, he wanted to break the cycle of distance that had settled between them. "Dad, what do you think about doing something together today?" Lucas asked, not taking his eyes off the coffee cup. Michael looked at him with gentle surprise, as if that was the last thing he expected to hear. "Something together?" he repeated, trying to absorb the suggestion. "What did you have in mind?" Lucas hesitated for a second, then smiled. "We could go to the park? Maybe take a walk?" The surprise in Michael's eyes turned into a soft understanding. He nodded slowly, a smile forming on his lips. "I think that's a good idea." Later, as they walked through the park, Lucas felt that something inside him was finally shifting. The cool breeze gently blew, and the yellow and red leaves fell from the trees, creating a colorful carpet on the ground. The park was full of life, but Lucas could only focus on the moment he was sharing with his dad. They walked in silence for a while until Michael suddenly started talking. "I know I haven't been very present lately," he said, his voice steady but with a touch of regret. "Ever since your mom passed, I've been lost. Work was a way to escape. I didn't know how to handle things at home." Lucas listened closely, absorbing every word. It was the first time Michael had ever spoken so openly about how he felt. Lucas had known his dad had suffered a lot after losing his mom, but he had never heard such a direct confession. "But I've realized," Michael continued, pausing for a moment to look his son in the eye, "that running away doesn't fix anything. I've missed you, Lucas, and I want to try to be a better dad. I believe we can make things better between us." Lucas felt a wave of emotion wash over him. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. Everything he had wanted for the past few years seemed to be happening right there, in that moment. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but the most important thing was that they were both willing to try. "I've missed you too, Dad," Lucas finally said, his voice low but filled with sincerity. "I just wish we could spend more time together. I think we both need that." Michael smiled, a smile Lucas hadn't seen in a long time, and nodded. "Then let's do that. Let's make things right." They continued walking through the park, and Lucas felt lighter than he could ever remember. The weight of Michael's emotional absence was starting to lift, and he felt that, like Harold and Nathan, he and his dad were on the path to rebuilding their relationship. Later, as they sat on a bench under the shade of a tree, Lucas spotted Harold and Rusty walking in the distance. He smiled when he saw that Harold looked more at ease, more at peace with himself, and then, as if guided by some invisible connection, Harold looked in Lucas's direction and waved from afar. Lucas waved back, knowing that Harold and Nathan were continuing to rebuild their relationship, just as he and Michael were starting to do. This journey of reconciliation was still in its early stages for both sides, but the important thing was that they had taken the first step. As the day came to an end and Lucas and Michael headed home, Lucas felt a new sense of hope fill him. He knew that challenges would still come, but he also knew that if he was willing to forgive and reconnect, things could change, not just for him but for everyone around him. Life, Lucas thought, was full of opportunities for new beginnings, and in that moment, he was determined not to let the past define the future. The days following Lucas's reunion with his dad were different. The silence that once dominated their house was being replaced by shy conversations and, sometimes, by comfortable silences. While both of them were still getting used to this new attempt at closeness, Lucas felt that, for the first time in a long while, there was a path ahead. A path they could walk together. The park remained Lucas's place of refuge. But now, when he walked the trails lined with fallen leaves, his thoughts felt lighter. He remembered all the mornings he used to come to the park, watch Harold from afar, and feel so connected to the quiet loneliness they shared. Today, all that seemed like a part of the past that he was beginning to leave behind. On that particular day, the wind was cold, but the sun shone brightly in the sky. Lucas arrived at the park as usual, but this time, he wasn't alone. Walking beside him was Michael, who, since that first outing, had committed to spending more time with his son. It was a silent promise they had made to each other, one that, little by little, seemed to be bringing new energy to their lives. "This park seems important to you," Michael said as they walked. He looked around, noticing the small details of the place that had once gone unnoticed by him. Lucas nodded, smiling slightly. "Yeah, it is. This is where everything started." "Everything?" Michael asked, curious. Lucas didn't answer right away. He thought of Harold and Nathan, of how a simple act of leaving drawings and chocolates had turned into something much bigger. He thought about how those quiet gestures, almost insignificant to others, had planted the seed of a reconciliation that had once seemed impossible. He realized that the park was more than just a place to escape the world. It was a place where connections, though invisible, blossomed. "I used to see a man here," Lucas began, his voice soft. "A homeless man, Harold, and his dog, Rusty. I'd see them every day, but he never knew I was watching. So, I started leaving things for him, drawings and chocolates." Michael looked at his son with interest, listening intently. "One day, he found out it was me. And, well, after that, he told me about his son, Nathan, and how they drifted apart. He seemed so sad but so stuck in his own pride. But then, something changed. And it was here, in this park, that they found each other again." Michael furrowed his brow, surprised at the depth of the story Lucas was telling. "And you helped that happen?" Lucas shrugged. "I guess so. But really, they were the ones who had to work things out. I just gave them a little push." Michael was silent for a few moments, taking in everything his son had said. He stopped walking and looked around the park, as if suddenly seeing the place with new eyes. "It's amazing how much small gestures can do, isn't it?" Lucas nodded. "Yeah. And I think that watching it all happen made me realize that we can fix things between us too." Michael looked at his son, moved by the sincerity in his words. "I want that too, Lucas. And I'm willing to do whatever it takes." The silence that followed was full of understanding. For the first time, they were truly connected, not just as father and son, but as people who recognized the importance of being there for each other. As they walked a bit further, Lucas spotted Harold sitting on his usual bench, with Rusty lying at his feet. Next to Harold was Nathan. It was the first time Lucas had seen them together since their reconciliation, and the sight filled him with peace. Nathan looked more relaxed, more at ease, as he talked quietly with his father. Lucas and Michael approached, and Harold waved at them with a smile. Rusty wagged his tail happily, as he always did when he saw Lucas. Nathan, noticing the boy's presence, smiled as well and stood up to greet him. "Lucas, good to see you," Nathan said, his voice full of gratitude. "We were just talking about you. My dad can't stop saying how much you helped with all of this." Lucas blushed a little, feeling a bit embarrassed by the praise, but smiled nonetheless. "I just did what felt right." Michael, standing beside Lucas, extended his hand to shake Harold and Nathan's. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you both," he said with a smile. "Lucas has told me about your story. It's inspiring to see what's happened here." Harold smiled, his expression full of gratitude. "Lucas is a special kid. I don't know if I would have had the courage to take that first step without him." Nathan nodded in agreement. "He helped us see what really matters." As they all talked, Lucas stepped back a little, watching the interaction from a distance. He realized how much everyone was connected by those small acts of kindness that had sparked such profound changes. And in that moment, Lucas understood something important. Human connections, though fragile, have the power to transform lives. When the conversation between the adults ended, Lucas and Michael said their goodbyes to Harold and Nathan. As they walked back home, Lucas felt a sense of peace inside him that he had never experienced before. The journey he had begun with a simple drawing and a piece of chocolate now felt like something much bigger. He had learned that forgiveness and reconciliation weren't just words. They were actions that required effort and courage, but in the end, they were worth it. When they arrived home, Michael did something unexpected. He placed his hand on Lucas's shoulder and, for the first time, pulled him into a firm and warm hug. "I'm so proud of you, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've taught me more than I could have imagined." Lucas hugged his dad back, feeling a wave of emotion wash over him. "I'm proud of you too, Dad." And so, they stood there for a few moments, together, sharing a moment that felt like the conclusion of a long journey, but also the beginning of something new. A few months passed since the day Lucas and Michael began rebuilding their relationship. Their conversations became more frequent, and their interactions more natural. The wounds left by Michael's absence were slowly healing, and Lucas felt that he and his dad were finally getting closer for real. It was Lucas's 9th birthday, and the day started quietly. The morning sun bathed the house in a soft light, and Lucas woke up feeling excited, but in a good way. He knew that this birthday would be different, not because of presents or cake, but because of his dad's presence, which now felt more real and constant in his life. When he came downstairs, he found Michael sitting at the table, smiling. "Happy birthday, son," he said in the warm voice Lucas had grown used to hearing. "Thanks, Dad," Lucas replied, smiling back. Michael seemed a little nervous, as if he had something special planned. He stood up from the table and left the room for a moment, returning with a large box in his hands. Lucas looked at the box, curious. It wasn't the type of present he expected, which made him even more intrigued. "I've thought a lot about what to give you," Michael began, placing the box in front of his son. "And I think this gift means a lot more than it seems. I want you to have something that will be with you, something that symbolizes everything we've been learning together." Surprised and a bit anxious, Lucas began opening the box. When he removed the top, a small furry nose appeared between the folds of paper. His eyes widened, and he let out a gasp of pure joy when he saw a puppy, an adorable little mutt with floppy ears and a wagging tail. "Dad!" Lucas exclaimed as the puppy jumped out of the box and started licking his hands. "It's a dog?" Michael smiled, seeing the happiness in his son's eyes. "Yeah, he's yours. After everything we've been through, I thought this little symbol of loyalty and friendship would be the right gift for you." Lucas picked the puppy up in his arms, feeling the warmth of the little animal against his chest. He couldn't believe what was happening. For so long, he had dreamed of having a dog, a faithful friend like Rusty was for Harold. But he never thought this day would actually come. "He's perfect," Lucas said, his voice choked with emotion. "Thank you, Dad." Michael stepped closer and placed a hand on Lucas's shoulder, his eyes filled with pride and affection. "I know a dog is more than just a gift. He's a commitment, a friendship that's going to last for many years. I want you to know that I'm here to help you with this, just like I hope we can keep helping each other moving forward." Lucas nodded, understanding the weight of his father's words. The puppy, now quietly nestled in his arms, seemed to be more than just a pet. He represented the new beginning that Lucas and Michael were building together, a symbol of forgiveness and reconnection. "What are you going to name him?" Michael asked, smiling. Lucas thought for a moment, and then, as if something inside him was guiding him, he said, "Charlie. I'm going to call him Charlie." The name sounded perfect. Charlie would be the loyal friend Lucas had always wanted, someone to share his joys, his sadness, and his adventures with. That afternoon, Lucas and Michael took Charlie to the park for the first time. The dog ran around excitedly, exploring the world around him with the same curiosity Lucas always felt when he drew or watched the people around him. As they walked, Lucas spotted Harold and Nathan again, this time sitting together, talking animatedly. Lucas waved to them, and Harold, seeing Charlie, smiled. "So, you finally got yourself a companion, huh?" Harold said, walking over to Lucas and petting the puppy. "Yeah," Lucas replied proudly. "This is Charlie." Nathan, standing next to his father, looked at Michael and smiled. "Seems like we're all starting a new chapter," he said with a tone of satisfaction. Michael nodded in agreement. "Yeah, I think that's exactly what's happening." The group continued walking through the park, with Charlie running around them, happy and full of energy. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and Lucas felt that it was the perfect ending to a journey that had started with small acts of kindness but ended up transforming everyone's lives. As they headed home, Lucas looked at his dad, and without saying a word, he knew they were both at peace. They had overcome the invisible barriers that had separated them, and now, with Charlie by their side, Lucas knew that the future was full of new possibilities. I hope you enjoyed this emotional story. If it touched you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any of our future stories. Share it with your friends and leave your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your opinions and suggestions, so we can continue bringing you stories that move and inspire.